Right. Now, my battery was dead in my little transmitter, so I'm going to be trying to record straight from the laptop. Let's keep my fingers crossed, right? I put up my notes, my lecture notes for the last class or two, I think, because the battery had gone down low enough that all the sound I had was so I figured since some people might have been counting on that, I decided to give you my notes instead. So that makes up for that. We have been talking about Etruscan art, this really early Italian art prior to the rise of Rome. And we were looking at these terracotta works, the sarcophagus from Cerveteri on your right, and this roof decoration from a temple in Veii showing Apollo, or as the Etruscans called him, Apollo. And we were talking about various characteristics of Etruscan art. One of them is a certain vibrancy that at this early stage in the 6th century, we simply don't see in archaic Greek art. It's much more lively, much more vibrant, much more individualized than anything we saw there. And we sort of sketched this out by looking at numerous comparisons to talk about how the stride forward, for example, of the Apollo figure is so much more adamant, striking and strong than what you would see in an archaic Greek work. These are all in terracotta and pressed into molds, which is the hallmark of Etruscan art. And at the very end of class, we were talking about how their skill in casting from terracotta led to a great skill in casting from bronze as well. And that the Greeks, who really didn't praise anybody else for anything, praised them for their ability to cast in bronze. And here with the Capitoline Wolf, and remember that the kids are a late addition, Renaissance addition to this, we have the same sort of vibrancy and activity and interest in natural detail that we saw in other works of Etruscan art, just now translated into bronze. This work is presented in your textbook as an Etruscan work, but we'll talk about him because he raises problems for us in a way by trying to stick him into a particular category. In the year 509 BC, the city of Rome decided to become independent from the Etruscan League, and they expelled their Etruscan king and began to function independently, 509 BC. And by 400, they actually were able to conquer all of the Etruscan towns. So they turned from being part of the Etruscan League to being Rome, with the Etruscan League all sort of assimilated into the growing realm, right? Now, during this early period, even though Rome is conquering larger territories, and we might talk about an empire, they are not ruled by an emperor. So we're not really talking about, in this early stage, the Roman Empire. What we're talking about is the Roman Republic. And that's because historians break up the 1,000 years of history of Rome. Right? 800 years of Rome. They break it up into two distinct periods. The first 500 years, beginning in 509, when they expel their Etruscan king, and ending with Julius Caesar, 44 BC, right? That's the Roman Republic. And the reason we shift that away or break that away from the Roman Empire is that under the Republic, rulers were elected. Now, it wasn't open democracy. Right? They were elected by a group of aristocrats, the Senate. But they were elected nonetheless, and they had term limits. Not term limits, but they weren't elected for life. Okay? This all changes with the Roman Empire, where you are emperor because your father was emperor, and you're emperor for life. Or you're emperor because you happen to bump off the current emperor and usurp the throne. And again, you would be emperor for life. Right? So, very different forms of government. Representative on a certain level during the Republic, imperial during the Empire, right? Inherited. So, for this reason, we sort of want to cubbyhole the 800 plus years of Roman history that we're going to talk about into these two distinct sections. And for the history of art, it's important as well because art during the Roman Republic has certain characteristics that are very different from art during the Roman Empire. And we'll talk about those as we look at this. Okay? So, the political distinction between the two hubs of Rome is actually matched as well by artistic distinctions between the two parts of Roman history. Okay? That said, during the Republic, Rome spreads and spreads. After subjugating all of the Etruscan cities, the Romans go on to colonize all of ancient Greece, including Asia Minor. So we talked about this when we looked at the Laocoon group, right? The man with the snakes. That was done by artists, Greek artists from Asia Minor, but it was made in Rome. That's a sign of this expanding sphere of the Roman world, right? So they colonized all of ancient Greece, all of the Mediterranean. They colonized all of North Africa, including Egypt. And that means that what we saw before with the Etruscans, this sort of sponging up of other elements from different cultures, right? Whether it's Greek, Hellenistic, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, this continues in ancient Rome as well. Continues during the Roman Republic and becomes an important part of Roman art in the empire as well. Is this adopting of all of the cultures that they conquered. Okay? Now, as Rome was doing this, now we'll come back to our sculpture in a minute. A cast bronze sculpture. The normal practice, the way the Romans were able to maintain control as they took over various regions, was that they would take a local leader and give him Roman citizenship. And leave him in charge now as a loyal servant of Rome. Right? And that way the people still felt that they were being governed by one of their own rather than sticking a general in there. Right? In America's little stories in the Middle East, they talk about the battle for the hearts and minds. That's kind of what the Romans did, right? Is they would find a local leader, usually the one that was already in charge, and after they've assimilated that region in, or that city in this case, they would then leave the leader in charge, but as a Roman citizen, right? So with this particular statue, that's exactly what we have here. There's an inscription on the hem of his garment down below that is written in Etruscan script. We know this because the Etruscans wrote right to left, the opposite of us. And you can probably tell, even though they're Latin letters, that it looks like it's a reversed slide, but it's not. That's the direction that the Etruscans wrote. So it's in Etruscan script, it's in the Etruscan language. And it identifies who he is, Aule Metele, and it even identifies his parents, son of, Ma and Pa Metele, if you will. Right? So if you think about that inscription in Etruscan and this sculpture, that's an important point of the communication. He is Etruscan by birth. He's Etruscan by heritage. And it's communicating to the Etruscans. But at the same time, the clothes that he wears are Roman. They identify him as a Roman citizen. Both the toga that he's wearing and also the sandals are particularly Roman. Only Roman citizens can wear these. And in fact, the Romans made the terrible fashion faux pas of wearing socks with their sandals. Right? And you can see them there at the top. There's where you see a little lace on the sandals and here. And he's got socks underneath it as well. So, I thought that was kind of silly. Flip-flops and socks on. That's what it is. Indeed it does. Or at least I think so, but, to each his own. Yeah? And so what we see here, of course, is this now Etruscan man dressed in Roman clothing, but with an inscription that reminds us exactly what his legacy was, because that's an important part of how the Romans decided to rule. And as you can tell from his posture, he's actually shown in the act of addressing his people. Right? He's giving a public oration. He's perhaps governing, right? Declaring the Roman rule. We don't know exactly what he's saying, but one must assume with a large public monument like this that that's basically what the message must be. I am here to rule. Yeah? In addition to having an Etruscan inscription, it also maintains much later, this was jumped 400 years, it maintains the Etruscan interest in vibrant activity, in realistic details, in a certain vivacity. So as he reaches, and a certain individuality as well. I have a detail of his hand where you can see the veins across the back of his palm and that wonderful ring that he's wearing as well. A real interest in the particularized details that we've seen going back to some of the earliest Etruscan art, such as that sarcophagus and terracotta that we looked at. You'll also notice that the figure is not idealized. He's not perfected. He's early middle age, 40-ish maybe, male pattern baldness a bit. He's got a bit of a paunch, kind of heavy in the arms. He's not rendered as an idealized Greek god or anything like that, but rather has that sense of individuality that we've seen in other Etruscan works. Remember that when those things came out of the cast, they always finished them with a spatula, right, in order to add detail, shift it around a bit. And that sense of immediacy, that sense of individuality has been a hallmark of Etruscan art, and that's the case for him as well. Now, this idea that he's older than many of the Greek figures, probably all of the Greek figures that we saw, this actually probably comes from certain traditions within Hellenistic art. This is in your textbook. Since Hellenistic art was so much interested in high drama and movement and becoming less timeless and more sort of bound by changes in time, we see with Hellenistic art images of the elderly. And since the Etruscans and the Romans are picking up everything they can from the Greeks through time, when we get to the period of this orator figure out of Metellus, we are actually at the period of Hellenistic art. And one might expect them to be deriving quite a bit from this. Yeah.
So, this man is considered like a local figure?
Definitely. Most definitely. It's a public monument. Probably be put up in a public square.
So is he real, or is he like a...
Yeah, that's his name, right? And it's given there. And even, like I said, the inscription says that it gives the name of his mother and father as well, right? So it's definitely a real person. Insofar as how we might document anything else we might know about him, I'm not 100% sure if we have or not. Yeah, no. No, I'm saying that they remain, the Etruscans through their entire tradition, as did the Romans, remain very much interested in Greek art. So it doesn't mean that they're just only interested in the old classical stuff, but they continue to be interested in modern Greek art as well. And this was done during the period of the Hellenistic period, right? And as such, it really remains very influenced by that later period of Greek art. Right? While it reflects this Etruscan realism that we've seen all along, as well as this Hellenistic influence, There's another thing that this interest in making him somewhat older, a little bit less idealized, is something else that reflects, and that relates directly to Republican Rome. During the Republic, during this early period when they're electing their leaders, the leaders were elected by the Senate. Yeah? Age was synonymous with status. The older you were, the more status you had. Right? We live now in a very youth-oriented culture, and that seems to be less the case. But age was status during the Roman Republic. And as such, we see works of art during the Republic that actually realistically show agedness, rather than trying to airbrush it or Botox it, right? As a modern analogy. And again, this comes out of the Hellenistic tradition. The only figures that really appeared aged throughout the history of Greek art were statues of philosophers. Philosophers appeared not only older, but with beards. Whereas most Greeks appeared clean-shaven and perpetually young. So this idea that agedness could be wisdom, right? Agedness could be status, comes directly out of an adoption of Greek traditions. Right? Now applied to politicians rather than simply to philosophers. And this led to something that we see throughout Republican art, and that is an interest in portraiture that emphasizes agedness. This is up at the Walters. We have one in your textbook in the room as well. You had to have a certain age to hold any political office. And so what we see are portraits that emphasize age as a sign of social status. That is so different, isn't it? I mean, really look at all the bad facelifts out there, you know? And you realize that the idea of looking old in our society ends up getting in the way of any sort of public status form right now. Right? We're in our political debates talking about the generational differences between, you people in the 70s like Bernie, or almost in your 70s like Hillary, or Trump for that matter, and the younger generation as well. Right? We really put a great stock in youth and vitality. But for the Republican Roman, agedness was a sign of status. Agedness was a sign of showing a rise. Right? And the Roman term for these portraits that emphasize the agedness of the figures is verism. And the term basically means realism. Right? It's a Latin variation of the word realism. Right? Think of the word very in English, right? It's very true. Things are true, they're not, right? That doesn't work. People say very unique, and it always bugs me because you can't be very unique, right? You're either one of a kind or you're not, But very comes from the same word as verism, this truth to nature. Although at the same time, they think they might be a little bit emphasized, right? Adding wrinkles, making them look maybe 10 years older, because this was the sign of status. And in fact, I don't think I have this in my notes or not, but the Senate, who elected the consuls, the leaders of Rome, the Senate, the word Senate in Latin, I think the word Senate, meant that you had to be old because the prefix S-E-N meant aged. In the same way that, when you guys get done with college, you're going to be seniors, right? S-E-N. As a prefix, it means older, wiser, right? And that's exactly the case here. So this idea is reflecting very much their political structure. Yeah, we have these nice 3 or 4 examples floating around the broader DC area, where we can see these ballistic Republican portraits that emphasize the individuality and age. And again, the Etruscan legacy is so strong for this, isn't it? That idea of individuality. Now being translated into Roman works of art. This is the one from your text, and since Halloween was just last week, you can actually show it. Looks kind of like Freddy from Nightmare on Elm Street. It is really, or the Mummy or something like that, right? It's been suggested that verism as a style in Republican portraiture came from the practice of making death masks. In other words, as soon as your elders were on their deathbed, or even just after they died, to memorialize them, one of the things Romans would do would be to make a plaster cast of their face. And then use that cast to press terracotta into it, or wax, in order to have, a memorial. Have you ever been down to Ford Theater downtown? Like they've got a death mask of Lincoln down there, right? So it's not like this was a crazy moment, It's something that people have done for a long time, was to make these casts of people's faces. And you'll notice that the skin on the fellow on the right really looks kind of aged and old. They're able to turn the marble into something that looks kind of crisp like old men's skin does. And may well relate to the marble version of one of these death mask casts. Right? Romans would then not only display these casts of their predecessors, but they would also carry them in civic processions. Now, not the marble versions, they're too darn heavy, right? One of these was over 50 pounds, right? Solid marble, you can't just walk around like this. So we see this guy here is carrying probably his father and his grandfather, casts of their faces, to show his legacy. And if we think back to the orator statue, Aule Metelle, remember it said, son of so-and-so and so-and-so. So heritage is really important to the Romans, where you came from and how you have inherited your status and how you've earned it through becoming increasingly elderly. Right? Women, not so much, right? They still are very individualized. They still seem quite like portraits, and not like Greek statues where, the face is somewhat anonymous, doesn't seem to be particularly individualized, but they do in fact give the sense that this is what the person truly looked like. And you can see that she still has some sagging in her neck, but nothing along the lines of what we see with the guys, with the men. So women, not nearly as veristic, right? They don't use verism quite so strongly. And that's probably because, the men were the ones who held political office. And so the idea of looking really old was more important to the men. I don't want to say that women were more vain or anything like that, because in fact looking old was a good thing. But we see verism much more strongly in male portraits than we do in female portraits. Now, in case you think that women weren't fully recognized, this is an over life-size statue of a Republican woman up in the Walters Museum. That we'll see a week from Saturday. Come along. A full-size public monument, probably put up in one of the squares of a local town, we don't know where from, and most likely a benefactor to the city. So they did value women. Maybe not as much as they might have, maybe not as much as they're valued in modern society, but at the same time, the portraits don't show the same ageism that we see with Republican men. Right? So this goes out of the Etruscan tradition, this early period of ancient Rome, these first 500 or so years that we're covering in rather quick order. Right? These elected Republican governments that we've been talking about lasted from 509 BC, when they evict their Etruscan king, all the way until the reign of Julius Caesar. Now, you probably know that. I remember reading Caesar in junior high, Shakespeare's Caesar. Do they still teach you that when you're in grade school? You have to read Shakespeare. I think things don't change that often. You read Twelfth Night and Caesar and maybe Macbeth. Person likes the blood he got, right? Okay, well, Caesar, as you well know, was murdered. for assuming too much power, right? For breaking the traditions of the Roman Republic. So he was elected by the Senate in 60 BC. He was elected to be consul. Rome usually had two consuls to balance the power. As consul of Rome, he personally led Roman troops to conquer vast swaths of territory. Anything that's sort of light beige, yeah, are areas that Caesar helped conquer. So you'll notice here's Rome, and we are talking about all of France, right? Northern part of Spain, northern part before, and then pushing into Asia Minor, right? Here's Pergamon, where that altar to Zeus was, right? Here's the Tigris and Euphrates, and you see how close we're coming to everything there. Significant amount of territory, and of course North Africa as well. So, major amounts of territory being brought under Roman control prior to Caesar, and then continuing during Caesar's time. With this increase of the Roman realm, right, the Roman world, Caesar was declared dictator in 48 BC. In other words, instead of being one of a pair of consuls, he becomes the lone leader. Now, we associate the term dictator with something evil, but originally dictator is just one, it's from the Latin word to speak, to dictate, right? The dictator is one who speaks, and it is so, right? And that was all well and good at first in 48 BC because he didn't declare himself dictator. They said, yes, you will be dictator, right? But then he goes to fight in Egypt to help Cleopatra fight against her brother, become the pharaoh of Egypt. And when he is successful in that battle, he declares himself dictator for life. Gets rid of the term. Right? And this is what causes him problems. This is what flies in the face of the Republican tradition. In Republican Rome, no one would rule for life. He would rule for a term that was determined in a series of checks and balances by other parts of government, like the Senate. Right? When Caesar declares, I will be in this position until the day I die, they say fine and they kill him. Right? The next year, 44 BC, he is knifed by the Senate on the floor of the Senate. Right? Each one of the senators picking up the knife to kill him, or so we were told. And that's when Brutus driving in the death knell, right? So, this really is the end of the Roman Republic, with the death of Caesar. Because that leads to a 14-year civil war, where various people are vying for political control to sort it all out.
So what happens while there's the Romans?
Oh, there's still, Rome is powerful enough with its armies, right, to still maintain control of those. Those don't break up by any means. In fact, we will see them not break up until about 400 AD, right? 410 is the first successful sack of the city of Rome ever, right? And so, and you think about 509 to 410 was 920 years. That's pretty good in the grand scheme of things. Oh, think about this. A 14-year civil war followed the assassination of Caesar. Ours was the bloodiest war in our entire history, and it lasted what? 3.5 or so years, right? 14. 4 times that. Yeah. History becomes rather small when you get a long way away from it, you know? You start thinking about these things in terms of, 14 years. Well, to me, it's a third of my life, a little bit more than that. To me, it's probably more than half.
And on that, note, what would you think, in 100 years, we're going to say, our art is like how, it doesn't look like?
They're going to wonder what all those statues to the great god Trogus was. I haven't figured that one out. I hate to speculate like that. It's hard to say, because we think,
Oh, they were pretty diverse. I mean, it was game diverse.
We've been pretty diverse pretty much ever since, I would say, the Baroque period, maybe. Because the 19th century is awfully diverse. And even 100 years ago, about 100 years ago, Picasso's already done it. We're, 2015, right? That's World War I is 100 years ago, okay? By that time, art had already fragmented into a dozen different isms, where you have different schools of art in different countries. And I think that, if anything, that's just only continued sense. What will they think about it? Probably what we think about 1915, when you're going to find some people who think that there's some really cool stuff going on, and some people who think that it was just absolutely the worst thing we've ever seen. A new dark ages. And you'll still find people that talk about it. Okay, so, even though Rome had conquered and colonized most of the Mediterranean up to the realm of Caesar, it was still a republic, right? It was still an elected government. It was not an empire yet, even though it had, empire-like dimensions. The murder led to a 14-year civil war, and Caesar's great-nephew Octavian, who you see here on the left in a portrait up at the Walters. I love the little beads in his eyes. Little bits in his pupils. But he won the battle after the 14-year civil war. Octavian won the civil war in 30 BC. Right? And he was crowned emperor. And when he was crowned emperor, he took a new name, Augustus. And this begins the Roman Empire. He will be emperor for life. 30 BC all the way to 14 AD, I think? When he dies? 40 plus years? That's also pretty good. Yeah. For a length of reign. But didn't Queen Elizabeth just have her 50th, or was it 75th? She just recently became the longest serving monarch ever in England. Right? She beat Queen Vic. Queen Victoria was, in the 19th century, the longest, 60-something years, and I think that Queen Elizabeth just transcended that. But it's rare that somebody's on the throne that long. Right? So this begins the Roman Empire. Under the Roman Empire, emperors were not elected. They either inherited power from a family member, or they took it by force. Right? That's the new tradition. That's what separates the empire, the Roman Empire, from the Roman Republic, Imperial Rome. So Octavian changes his name to Augustus, is our first emperor. The very first Roman emperor. And we see him in this portrait bust fragment at the Walters, damaged across the top on the right side down by his neck as well. Here's one that's in your textbook in a different museum, where we can see that, in fact, it's important that the portraits of him all look the same. He needs to be recognized. These are put in public places. And as he's proclaiming his rule over Rome, he needs people to be able to recognize him. Okay? And so he always looks exactly the same. And what's interesting is that he's emperor for more than 40 years, but the portraits never change. Verism is over. He always looks like he looked when he took the throne. He always looked like he looked when he was crowned emperor. Roughly 35-ish, healthy, fit, even in portraits that are made when he's in his 70s. He never changes. Because it's more important that people recognize him than it looks like what he looks like. Right? Then it resembles his facial features. So that whole Republican interest in verism, right? Agedness as a sign of qualification for rule, that's been totally ended. And Augustus appears the same age, no matter what. Right? So the one on your right, first century CE, he's going to be in his 60s. Maybe even in his 70s when that was made. But he looks exactly the same as he did significantly earlier, 30 years earlier. Right? Someone was raising their hand.
I was thinking, like, we wanted, almost like we wanted to try and use the people the same age.
I think that Okay, the idea of eternal youth is definitely, I think, an important one, because remember that one of the things that led to the Civil War was Rome's involvement with Egypt, very deep involvement, and Antony and Cleopatra, those Shakespearean play, right? That dealing with this interest in Egyptian things on the part of Rome. In fact, we'll see sphinxes decorating some of Augustus's armor in various ways. And certainly the idea of being perpetually young was very strong in Egyptian art, wasn't it? The pharaohs invariably looked fit and young, and as part of their political theology that they remain young. Remember, they had that Headset festival that said after you've been on the throne for X number of years, you had to go through this proving of your health again and again. So I think what I was saying before about how Rome borrows things from every culture that it conquers, the idea that he's going to be eternally young now, because he's going to rule for life like the pharaohs did, right, and pass it to his son. That's really important, So I think that you're onto something.
We've also gotten that idea from Caesar while he was still in his reign, while he was helping out.
Exactly. I mean, the idea of getting Egyptian stuff certainly came from that. But if you remember the portrait of Caesar that we had up a little while back, still followed the veristic traditions, right? Which is the idea of looking aged. He had, he's bald on the top. So Caesar never really picked it up himself, right? Augustus does. His nephew does. Yeah. So I think it's important for us to remember that Rome had conquered Egypt, and this probably helps cement the idea. You'll also notice, if you look at the two, that the sense of recognizability, of repetition of the basic facial features, even goes as far as the hairdo, right? The hairdo is exactly the same in every one of them. You get these two here, right? The other one coming the other direction, and then three of them over here. And that's in every single portrait, right? It's the exact same dude. And that's part of the way in which he could be identified, is that same hairdo that appears. So it's portraiture, definitely, in that people associated it with him, but doesn't look the way he looked. It must have at first, right? But the fact that his hair is always exactly the same suggests that these are stylized so that people could recognize them at any point, anywhere you look. Now, the most famous of these statues of Augustus is the one that stood at the main gate into the city of Rome, the Prima Porta, right? The main gate. So we call it the Augustus Prima Porta. It's in the Vatican collection. Because it's actually a copy, a marble copy of a bronze original that's been lost. The original was made around 20 BC, and he's life-size, 6 feet tall. This was originally erected right by the gate, in a way to welcome people to Rome. Obviously, there's great similarity between him and our old friend, the Roman Etruscan, right? Aule Metelle. In other words, what Augustus is trying to show us, I think, being very careful about his uncle, Julius Caesar, he's trying to show us that he's a man of the people. He's addressing us. He's talking to us. So it goes back to these earlier traditions to communicate a very important message for him, one that's probably intended to help save his skin. At the same time, there's a real subtle difference here. Look at his hand. Instead of, friends, Romans, countrymen, and your ears, he's pointing. What does that do? Directing, right? He's telling, right? He's leading. Yeah? So he takes that tradition of being a man of the people, but he translates it in his new role as the perpetual leader, pointing the way forward. So one source for the Augustus Prima Porta, one of the prototypes that it brings in, is this older tradition of the local leader, the man of the people. So he transforms that somewhat. The other major influence on this sculpture is Greek sculpture. And if you look at the figure from the waist down, you'll notice that the placement of the feet is almost identical. Right? He's in basic contrapposto pose. It's been altered a bit, but it's certainly nowhere near as dramatic or flamboyant as something from the Hellenistic period. Right? He has that gentle weight shift, the way in which the body opens different directions, the counterpoised balance of flexed versus relaxed, where the flexed leg is on the opposite of the flexed arm holding that spear. All of these things bring another element to it. Right? He may be a man of the people, but just like this ageless idea, he's perfect. Right? And this is something that, again, separates the imperial period from the republican period. It's this idea of the almost divine emperor. In fact, I shouldn't say almost divine. Augustus will, in fact, make claims to divinity. Not while he's alive, but after he's dead. And just like the pharaohs, who believed that when their leaders died, they joined the gods in the sky, the Romans believed the same thing. But Augustus goes somewhat a step further. And this is symbolized by the little figure of Cupid. Right? You might say he looks like an angel, but he is Cupid, the son of Venus, the goddess of love, who is riding a dolphin. That's because Venus was born out of the ocean. Right? So he's surfing on this dolphin. The tail of the dolphin goes up on his back. And you'll notice that he's reaching up to touch the hem of Augustus's garment. You know the reference for that? Right? And she felt that if she could only touch the hem of his garment, right? I actually said John, I forget which of the gospel, right? But Christ encounters a crowd, and there's a woman that says, if I can only touch the hem of your garment, I'll be healed. That would be enough. And that's because in Roman society, we have to keep in mind that Christ lived in this early, basically this period. The idea of touching the hem of a garment was a sign of respect, a sign of humility and respect, giving honor to the person by touching the hem of the garment. So here, the son of the goddess of love, like God himself, right, is in fact reaching up to touch the hem of Augustus's garment, giving him honor. So the gods are, in fact, bestowing their honor upon him. Right? Now, this goes a step further. Augustus actually traced his family tree back to Aeneas. Remember Aeneas? The founder of Rome, right? The ancestor of the two kids that were nursed by the wolf, Romulus and Remus, right? The one who had actually survived the Trojan War, right? Founder of Rome, Aeneas. Augustus traced his family tree back to Aeneas. This is, I don't think he probably was, but this is part of the propaganda to be fit to the emperor for life. I descended from the founder of Rome, right? According to mythology, Aeneas descended from Venus. Right? So that means that Augustus descends from Venus. Augustus's heirs, Augustus's ancestors, can be traced right back to the gods. Which makes the idea of Cupid touching the hem of his garment that much more poignant, doesn't it? Because it again shows his legacy as the heir to heaven, right? The heir to the gods. And this whole story about Aeneas descending from the gods, descending from Venus herself, founding Rome, and leading eventually to the line of Augustus, this is all told in the Aeneid, written by the poet Virgil and sponsored by none other than Augustus. He paid Virgil to write this. Virgil was his court poet. So the poetry, like the statue, becomes a piece of propaganda. that our new emperor for life has a lineage that goes back to the gods. That on one hand, he might be addressing us as one of us, but we should be very thankful that he does, because he's godlike. Right? He has their blood in his veins. And again, think of all the traditions where we've seen people who have gotten messages from the gods to give them. Right? Hammurabi. Yeah? Comes immediately to mind. I giggle because I'm trying to avoid making political comments. But how many people running for president, how many different people running for president told me that God wanted them to do that? Each and every one of them, right? So anyway, suffice to say, what goes around comes around. This idea of associating with the gods is picked up further on his breastplate.
It looks really militaristic.
It does. It's very militaristic, and there's sphinxes, by the way. These are clasps up here that hold it together, and you can see the sphinxes on those clasps that hold it together. It's a leather breastplate, right? So it would open like a clamshell, clamp around your body, and look like this over the shoulders, right? And it's meant, of course, to function for protection, but one that's this beautifully decorated would never be worn in actual battle. It's a ceremonial version of battle armor, right? And a decorative version. So what we see him in is wearing something that reminds us that he was a military leader, and we know that he was, but furthermore is something that's far more special than that, something that in fact contains all these figures that you wouldn't want, or something you want in a battle, because you can take a sword and all of a sudden you lose a figure, right? And why pay someone to do that if that's the way it's going to be? Now, the decorations here are chosen with care. The decorations here are all very symbolic. They again associate him with the gods, which seems to be the underlying theme of this great man of the people who was descended from the gods to help us out. In the center, directly beneath his pectoral muscles, we see two figures. This is a victory in a battle, the Parthian War, where the enemies of Rome are returning the military center to Rome at the end of the battle. So on the right is our Parthian. You'll notice he's bearded. On the left is our Roman, clean-shaven. Pick this up from the Greeks, right? And the fellow on the left, who is he? He's not Augustus. He's not Tiberius. Some people have thought that. I think what he is a personification. He's not any one person in particular, but he's a representation, an allegory for Rome itself. Now, why do you suppose I think that? What's up here? Sorry? No, this guy here is a personification of an allegory for Rome itself. Indeed, there's that towering wolf by his feet, right? And remember that our she-wolf that we saw? Right? Indeed, and she was all shivery and jittery and nervous and anxious as well, right? That becomes the standard way of depicting the wolf that nursed Romulus and Remus. So the fact that that animal is at his feet is not that he just got a faithful dog or something. It's a representation of the fact that this is meant to be Rome itself, right? So Rome is receiving the military standards from its defeated enemy. And there's a distinction being made by facial hair amongst other things. Romulus and Remus, the descendants of Aeneas, right? They were abandoned in the woods. And that's where the word Rome comes from, right? Romulus. And where the Romulans come from. Directly beneath this, we see another personification. The god of the earth, or the goddess of the earth, Tellus. Basically, Mother Earth to the Romans. And she's reclining. It looks like she's a man, but she's not. She's kind of damaged around there, right? The marble's kind of a bit discolored. But she's leaning back and has on her lap a cornucopia, a horn filled with fruit, a horn of plenty. And she's got a couple of children kneeling next to her, who she is going to be nurturing. So the gods are surrounding this, and all of them are looking up and basically sanctioning this event, saying this is okay, saying that they smile on this turn of events that we're seeing with the return of the Standards to the Romans, this great military victory. Up above that, just beneath his chin, we actually see the sun god Apollo driving a team of horses. Directly beneath, personification of the sky, holding that bolt of fabric over his head. And this is directly beneath Augustus's Adam's apple. So here is the sun itself also swirling around in this central event. The things that Augustus has brought into being, this great military victory, are taking place in the realm where the gods exist, where the gods are smiling on it. We know that's Apollo, not only by his placement, but by the fact that he drives a chariot that's drawn by 4 different horses. This is the standard Roman depiction for Apollo, and it's called a quadriga. Quad should help you remember that, right? A chariot with 4 horses. When you see someone in a chariot with 4 horses, you should immediately think, there's an Apollo reference here, right? Apollo is the god that Augustus will most associate himself with of all of the gods. It's almost like his patron saint, his most closely associated god. Yeah, Carlos. It's the four-horse chariot with 4 horses, right? This idea of associating yourself with Apollo sets the stage for later emperors, most of whom will also associate themselves with Apollo. You think that, again, Egypt should come to mind. Remember the pharaohs? Who did they associate themselves with? Ra, right? The sun god. So the Romans are simply adopting that practice and switching it up a bit. So we have this new emperor proclaiming himself as being in the realm of the gods, doing things that the gods approve of, that we see on this decorative breastplate in the statue on your right. Augustus continues to conquer various parts or sew up various parts of the empire, including Spain and France, what the Romans called Hispania and Gallia. And in 13 BC, when he was done sort of bringing peace to Spain and France, bringing them under Roman rule, he comes back to Rome in a triumphal procession. And the Senate orders an altar to be built to usher in this new era of peace that Augustus has brought about. They're celebrating the empire. Right? This new experiment in government is going to lead to an era of prosperity and peace, or so they say. Right? And as Roman historians write about it, they talk about 200 plus years of peace. It's a big fallacy. They're always fighting. But, let them. And this era is known to the Romans as the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, that was brought about by Augustus through these military victories over the enemies on the border. Now, there's going to be a 10-minute art fix that talks more about the Areopagus and its decoration. I'll probably record it later tonight or tomorrow morning, so that should be up very soon. So we'll talk about that a bit more online. This was put up again after conquering Spain and France. After conquering Spain and France, Augustus also has to figure out ways to keep Spain and France loyal to Rome. Again, this battle for the hearts and minds. And we saw that under the Republic, what the Romans did was to put local leaders back in charge, right? Find somebody that you trust, make them a Roman citizen, leave them there. What Augustus does is to go on a bit of a charm offensive. So putting things up, doing building in the regions he's conquered in order to, 1, show that Rome is here to stay, and 2, to give a little something back to the people he's conquered. So here we're in Gallia, France, in the city of Nîmes, right? Rome's all the way down here. And this is part of the region that Augustus has recently conquered. And after conquering, he sends his builders in to try to improve life for the people that conquered, to show them that life under the Romans won't be that different than the life that we enjoyed before, and in fact, it might be even better. And so one of the first things he does in this region, the south of France that he's conquered, is he puts up a series of aqueducts to transport clean, clear, cool water from a fresh spring 30 miles outside of town, all the way into the city of Nîmes. And it's all powered by gravity. Roman engineering is spectacular, right? This water runs from the source to the city of Nîmes across valleys. And that's what we're seeing with the Pont du Gard. It's the bridge that crosses the River Gard. I swam in the River Gard once. Actually, it's just down the hill from there. And it's pretty clean. But I think the spring water is even cleaner, right? And so it keeps flowing down this across the top of the pont, all the way into Nîmes. It's covered to keep bird crap out of it, right? And rodents and whatnot. It supplied 100 gallons per person per day. Yeah. 100 gallons. It's an incredible Roman engineering, right? And imagine now you're a resident, you're a Gaul, right? And you've just been conquered by Rome, and the first thing he does is he says, hey, guess what? Fresh clean water every day, pipes to your home. It's like, not so bad being conquered, right? There's a line in Casablanca where Bogart says, he's talking about drinking champagne that was throwing away, and he goes, and Sam, the piano player, says, this is going to take the sting out of being occupied, right? And that's kind of the whole idea, right? They're being occupied by a foreign territory, but what they're saying is like, hey, we're going to bring some good things to you. And it's so different than the sorts of things we saw with, think of Naram Sin, right? What was being conquered by Naram Sin mean? It means he's got an arrow in his throat. And in this case, it means you get something quite good in return, right? So 30 miles straight, it runs downhill all the way to the city of Nîmes, where you can get 100 gallons a day. One quick story about Nîmes. Nîmes is where we get the word denim. It's the fabric of the workers in the 19th century in the city of Nîmes. So it was the fabrique de Nîmes, and we just turned it into denim. So it's fashion people. A little something. Well, Augustus's heirs continued to govern. And the third emperor in Augustus's line was Caligula. And we have a full-size statue of Caligula. You can tell there's somebody standing behind it, right? Full-size statue of Caligula down, or more than full-size, down in Richmond at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. We don't know much about Caligula from the time of his reign. There's very little writing from the period when he was alive to clue us in as to what he was really like. However, there is a major biography that was written about 75 years later, 60, 75 years later. And it was written during a time when Augustus and his entire family was not particularly well liked. And they attributed to Caligula all sorts of horrible things. Said he was narcoleptic. That's not so horrible. It's just unfortunate, right? Had a habit of just conking out, right? Like people in this room, right? People in an art history club. But he also, this biography says, and again it was written after his death, said that he claimed to be a living deity, a god himself, the brother of Jupiter, and that he put a bridge from his palace to the temple of Jupiter so he could hang out with his brother every day. Right? And he's also, according to this biography, known for putting his head on statues of gods, right, to associate himself with them. He became basically the paragon of Roman decadence. Have you heard his name before? Caligula? It's actually not his given name. His name means little boots. Caliga are Roman military boots, and Caligula, when he was a child, right, because he was in before he was emperor, when he was a child, he used to dress up in a military uniform and go play with the troops and pretend to order them around, and apparently they all liked it, and that's how he got the nickname Caligula, right? His name is Gaius something, I always forget, right? But you probably heard him, he's like a paragon of Roman decadence, and it's all because this biography that was written about him 60 plus years later made him into a demon, right? Because the Romans had gotten so fed up with Augustus' line of emperors by that time. Right? He became so decadent that there was a movie in 1979. I was still living at home, and Mom wouldn't let me go see it. I was at 19. And it had Malcolm McDowell fresh out of Clockwork Orange in it, and very young Helen Mirren. He was Caligula, and it was rated X. And it was produced and directed by the guy who published Penthouse magazine. And so it was still like Penthouse Playmates and blood and just the stories that I'm too sad not to know. I think I have to know these things. Well, apparently no, he performs an abortion with his mouth. Yeah, a C-section abortion with his mouth. But that kind of made me think I don't really want to see this movie. And I could have brought him a different movie poster, but I thought since this is a Catholic institution, but it was exactly. It was apparently right with origins and followed this later biography, right? So what we find happening almost immediately is that, not almost immediately, within 100 years, the Romans turned sour to this whole idea of imperial leadership. It doesn't mean it's going to be over yet, right? Because they end up attributing it all to the bad lineage that was established by Augustus, right? There's bad blood in that line. There's another over-life-size imperial statue up at the Walters Art Museum, and you'll notice that the pose is really similar. And look at how the toga is draped around the shoulders, right? Now, the face isn't Caligula here, and we don't exactly know who he is. And so based on the style of the toga, the placement of the feet, right, the basic arrangement of the pose, suggests to us that it comes from basically this period, the period of Augustus' lineage. But we're not sure who he is. But he sure seems similar in some ways to Caligula on your left. Does anyone know who the end of Augustus' line is? Or the last one in the Augustan lineage is? Nero, who said that? Robert? Yeah, exactly. Nero is the end of the line. The Emperor Nero. What do you know about Nero? He was crazy. He burned Rome. But he didn't burn Rome so much as he turned a blind eye to Rome as it burned, right? The legend is that he was so, again, decadent, and a lot of this is written by that, post-Nero, but some of it's in truth. Rome did burn under his reign, right? But that he was so caught up with just pleasing his physical desires that he was sort of sitting on the roof of his mansion while Rome was burning, and he was playing the violin. He was an amateur violin player. And Rome burned while Nero fiddled, right? And I think that's probably why we talk about fiddling around. Use that as a term, right? It's like you're doing something inconsequential when you shouldn't be doing something else. So Nero is the end of Augustus' lineage. It's like the 6th or 7th in his line.
He didn't have any kids.
He didn't have any kids. Yeah. Just as well. What happened was, after the fire that burned Rome, the Senate convicted him for the crime of letting Rome burn, right? And they convicted him and sentenced him to death. And they were coming to get him, and he killed himself, rather than let them prosecute him and put him to death himself. And at that point, he had no children, so that's the end of the line, right? And again, it leads to a very brief civil war over the next couple of years, brief by Roman standards, over the next couple of years, and one of the generals under Nero becomes the next Roman emperor. He's a totally different family. Okay? This is Vespasian. is the general who becomes emperor after Nero. And actually, in this work up at the Walters, it's a portrait of Nero. We know this from various proportions that he's recarved with his own features. Right? So this is Vespasian. Okay? The first emperor after Nero, a new family line. Okay? Our second dynasty of Roman emperors. And in many ways, one of the first things that he has to do is to distinguish himself from Augustus' family. He's got to say, I'm different. Now look at the portrait. How's he doing it? What has he done to make himself different from the Augustus hairstyle? Totally different hairstyle. In fact, even Nero, you might argue, still has some of that, Augustan locks to his hair. But what do those add up to? He's older, right? All of a sudden you have a leader that's not eternally youthful, but someone who shows the effects of time and aging. What does that remind you of? Sorry? Yeah, verism, exactly. Did you say venison? Close. Verism, right. The old Republican era that had been, cast aside with the beginning of Augustus and his line. So in many ways, what this portrait is saying symbolically is that, hey, the good old times are back. I have the qualities of the leaders of Rome prior to Augustus and his family, and that I will lead Rome in that way, which was good, rather than the decadence of his family that has just been overthrown. I don't think I could. The good old times are back. Yeah, that's it, right? The good times of the Republic are back. And our leader is not interested in showing himself perfect and eternally young, but in fact has the age of wisdom, right? Or the wisdom of age. Indeed, or certainly more normal, right? No, he didn't, but his sons would, and that would get them into trouble. I think, the old adage that absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? Comes to the fore here. What's interesting is that under Vespasian, this idea of having portrait-like sculpture comes back. And we get a sort of trickle-down effect, if you will, right? Where aristocrats have portraits that look incredibly like portraits. This is a terrific, almost veristic portrait, even though it's under the reign of Vespasian. So that idea of showing yourself, instead of being idealized, perfected, perpetually young, the idea that you can show yourself as individualized, as having particular ages, this comes back into style during Vespasian. Yep. One last slide. We ended the last couple classes early. Vespasian's first official act on becoming emperor, they learned a lesson from Augustus. Give something back. The first thing he did after this was to erect an amphitheater in Rome for entertainments for the people. And he opened the Colosseum with 100 straight days of entertainment, games that people could watch. So, again, the battle for the hearts and minds, right? Rome has a new emperor. If it's that easy to take over when you're not inheriting it, he's got to worry about somebody else thinking the same thing, right? And at this point, the first thing he does on becoming emperor is to give the people something so that they will support him. And that something is entertainment. Take their minds off the Civil War. And the Colosseum is that. Seated 60,000 people, had a retractable roof, right? Had compartments under the floor with trap doors. Right, there we are inside the Colosseum. Yes, they didn't have Russell Crowe, but they did have gladiatorial combats with wild animals and things that could pop up from beneath the floor. One of the records we have is that they were able to flood They had naval battles. One of them had 300 ships. Yes, 300 ships fighting on the water that you could then get tickets to go see. Yeah, exactly. So for real, without the plastic, right? Indeed. So this is the Ephesians first act, right? Is to give the people of Rome something that will make them rally to his support, right? Okay, we'll wrap up Rome on Thursday. There's going to be some screencasts and a review sheet. Quickly, before you guys pick up, just give me 1 second here. I'm torn as to what to do with the review sheets, to make them do after the exam or before the exam. If I make them do before the exam, you get feedback. If I make them do after the exam, you can study. So I just want a show of hands. Who would rather have a review sheet? Because I think you need one yet for Etruscan, Republican Rome. Who would rather have 1 or 2 of those before the exam? Okay. Who would rather have it after the exam? I think I've got more hands before. So what I'll do is I'll split it up, right? There'll be more before. I've got an idea. I'll put them out there and you can turn them in before, but I'll still take them after. That's everybody, right? And then those who want the feedback can in fact get it. Cool. I'll put that up today or tomorrow morning.
Thank you.